program, a master's program at San Francisco State University. The date is April 31st, 1995, and I'm interviewing Mr. Howard Hickerson of 1707 63rd Street in Berkeley. I'm interviewing about his Army experiences in World War II in the all-black 93rd Division. And Howard, I'm going to start off with your background. When and where you were born. I understand you're from this area?
I was born in Alameda, May 21st, 1916.
And when did you enlist?
Well,
join the service?
I was drafted. I didn't enlist.
Drafted.
I was drafted on October 26, 1942.
And I can't do the math. How old were you?
I was about 26, I'd say 26 years old.
Okay, 26, and you were drafted.
Mm-hmm.
Had you had any inclinations before that to join the Army, or you were waiting to be drafted, or what were your feelings about serving in the military?
I was working for the Civil Service at Naval Supply Center for the government, federal government, and as I had started in 1940 for federal work. So in working over at Naval Supply Center, from Mare Island, I was familiar with government work and federal work and military, because we were involved in loading ships and those kind of things. So I was familiar with the military, and when I knew I was getting close to being drafted, I figured, the friends around me, I wanted to join the Coast Guard. They were not taking any, say, Negroes in the Coast Guard at that time. Period. Not even as steward. So I couldn't join. So I didn't want to go in the Navy, so I just waited my time out, and they drafted me into the Army.
Did you have any thoughts at the time, or can you recall your thoughts, or even how you feel now, about the segregated armies, that you knew that once you went into the service, whichever branch would take you, and so you took into the Army, that it was segregated, and there were apparently divisions within the black community as to whether the service should be integrated or segregated, or were you part of that?
No, at that time, I can't remember of any friction at that time, because the war was on, and everybody was not everybody, but many people of my age, men of my age, were being drafted, some enlisting, and I really didn't know that there was going to be, or didn't expect it to be, or I didn't think about it, being a segregated military unit, because where I was working, it was integrated.
Right.
So it never dawned on my mind, that part of it. It never entered my mind. But I wasn't rebellious about it. I never thought about it that way.
Where did you get your information about the war? In other words, what media, newspapers, magazines, what did you look at to find out the story of the war, besides your work effort, where obviously you were right on the...
This was before I went in?
Right.
We had it from the radios. Now, prior to Pearl Harbor, when the war was in Europe, the civilians at that time, I don't know what they were, unless you had a close relative in the military, I don't think the civilians were too much. It was the war was in Europe. Europe was a long ways away. They had gone through, many of the people gone through World War I, so they didn't get too much involved into World War. We'd come out of Depression. Everybody was poor in Depression. The military buildup, like the shipyards and different places, were hiring a lot of people. So we were getting more, we were living more better, so we never thought about that part of it. So our news came in mostly from the radio and from newspapers. There wasn't very many articles on it, like they didn't have, Newsweek and those things. We did, maybe Life magazines, but that was what it was.
So you did look at
we looked at
Life
Life magazine
for the images.
Yes.
And the radio. And
Being
the
no television, why, you got it fed to you from the had regular commentators, like there'd be the Dan Rather of that day was another radio man, you know.
In your early military experience, tell us about your experience traveling to and arriving at Fort Huachuca. So that's where you went first.
We started, I was drafted, actually sworn in Sacramento. That's where I was sworn into the military. And there was, I left, there was two of my very close friends. We'd known each other for years, since high school days. And we went in together on the same train, everything down to, we went in after we were sworn in. We left from Woodland then and went on a train to Monterey, California. We stayed there 2 weeks in Monterey, and then we went just getting our equipment and things. At that time we were they gave us our IQ tests to see where we would land in the military. If you had a higher IQ, different places. If you had a high enough IQ, they probably would see if you were officer candidate selectee, you know, there. And if you weren't, why then you got branched off. Now the officers had already been assigned around, or they had been their officers, and they were in the divisions around. So enlisted men then, you started out then with whatever branch you thought you fit into. Now they put most of the Negro, I'm going to say Negro, that's the call at that time.
That's perfectly fine.
At that time. They put them, many of them in the quartermaster, they were in the quartermaster units. We had just started forming a year before that, right along there, they were forming the infantry divisions, which was the 93rd. So the branches they were going into then was a quartermaster. So that was what we were in. When we went from there, I was assigned then to Fort Huachuca. That was the 93rd Division. And I was assigned to the Signal Corps because I had some experience in typing. That's one of the reasons I think that I was assigned to this unit. I had experiences in typing and some clerical.
How were you treated at Fort Huachuca?
I was treated. Fort Huachuca was, it was a all Negro unit, Afro-American unit. 95% of them, I guess. Well, the enlisted men were all, of course. But the officers, there was treated very good at Fort Huachuca. There was no problem at Fort Huachuca that I came across at all in Fort Huachuca.
How about the locals in Bisbee, Arizona, or did you go to Mexico? Or?
We went to, we would go to Mexico, we'd go to little border towns, Agua Prieta, Bisbee, and Douglas. Now, the little towns we went to, we had certain places we would go to in those towns. Well, being most towns that way, most military towns had places that were off limit to military where it was not. So the social life then we had would be over in Mexico. And where, when I say social life, why, that's where you kick your heels up, and there was lots of little Mexican girls over there, and you know, that's where the good living was for a while.
So you could go into Mexico on weekends,
yes,
or
weekends,
when you had your leave passes?
Weekends or pass, you'd have a pass, and you'd go across the border with your pass and stay at the weekend, then you had to come back. You'd have a 3-day pass, you'd go over and spend the night, or whatever it was, in Mexico, little small towns, and then you'd come back to your unit. You know, they had, we had private vehicles that go, and then they would have trucks. I think we had trucks that time. They would take them down to the border on this side and then shuttle back and forth. We weren't really too far from the border. Fort Huachuca isn't too far from the border.
Were you first placed at Fort Huachuca?
In Fort Huachuca, my first official post, when you get to the unit, go to the camp itself, you go to the basic barracks where everybody goes into. And from that basic barracks then, or unit, then you're assigned, I was in the basic, I'd say about a week, and then I was assigned to the Signal Corps in there. At the same time, everybody was in there, and they were assigned then different ones to their artillery and the different units within the division.
And what were your tasks? So you were typing, you had a
My first
background in
task,
typing?
my first task after I got through basic training, went through all the basic, right, and finished up basic and was kind of in advanced basic. They wanted to know if there was anybody out there that was, which ones were in there that had typing experience. They needed clerics. And they said we know there's some, because they kind of, got mixed up who was who. And so I said, yes, I've had typing. So they took me into the office then, the first sergeant and the company commander, and asked me some questions and gave me a roll typewriter or what, a little test, and I was good at it. I was always a pretty good typist and good at shorthand. I had it in high school. So I was immediately assigned then as company clerk, one of the company clerks.
And I imagine that your company commanders, et cetera, they were white officers.
They were white officers.
How were you treated by the white officers at the camp?
White officers treated us, as far as I'm concerned, they treated us very, very, very good. I mean, there was, at that time, you're going to war. So you're going to be probably in a combat zone. So it was more, the officers they had their discipline to keep, and it was tough. It was tough on officers. I could see it was to be tough, because here they had soldiers and everybody that had no education. So you had them from no education. Some of the guys had never, finished high school or anything, and they didn't know anything about discipline. The discipline was, so this had to be taught into it there. But as far as the officers concerned, the military officers, I said they were all white, but I'm wrong. In my unit, there was all white. But in the different divisions, like the artillery and the infantry divisions, there was Negro officers in there, in the divisions. And we respected them and they respected us. So there was no breakdown in that part, per se, with the officers.
And you were training for, did you know that you were going to be shipped to the Philippines, or no?
No. We were just doing training, just doing military training at the Fort Huachuca. For the division was doing all kind of training as a division would do, because infantry division could be assigned anywhere. It could be assigned to Europe, could be assigned to Asia, China, anywhere. So you had to train then, I don't care where you are, if you're going to go to China or Philippines or anywhere, shooting artillery guns is a certain way you train to do this. If you're going to set up, like in our unit, set communications up, you had to be trained how to take Morse code, how to run wires, and communications. The infantry, they had to learn how to make certain units go out on reconnaissance, and everybody had to dig foxholes. We didn't know what we were going to do. We had the same training at this time now in Fort Huachuca. That was just training, military training. To Camp Polk, Louisiana. Then we went through more or less training for, that gave you training how to react in wet weather, or the swamps down there. Swamps, and it was bad living.
And it was training maneuvers that you went to Camp Polk,
Camp
Louisiana,
Polk.
and stayed for 2 or 3 weeks or something?
No, we were there for several months. Let's see. Let me think now. I'd say we were there for probably 2 months.
And what sort of maneuvers did you engage in there? So what would your day be like?
Well, you were out. This was your first, other than little basic things in Fort Huachuca, this was your first taste of getting a field temp and sleeping on the ground, sleeping under rain, sleeping under, working and training under simulated combat conditions. They would have go out into an area like we were going to be attacking a unit or being attacked, learn how to be offensive or defensive, And then they'd have the airplanes come over, the P-40s and P-39s would fly over, and they'd have, instead of bombs, they would have a white sack of flour. And they would come zoom low enough and pop this flour down, you know, there, and wherever it hit, well, this powder would go. And then they would teach us, see, now if this was a bomb and you were this here, you'd be dead. See?
So it was war games
War
all
games,
during
war games,
the
war
days.
games. Night and day, they teach how to.
At night you go out for night
Oh, yeah,
maneuvers.
oh, sure,
and
night
things.
maneuvers and night marching.
Now, what about the people around Louisiana? Was this your first trip to the South?
My first trip to the South. Now, when I say Camp Polk took in it encompassed a whole lot of land, Camp Polk per se was barracks and things, but they took in a lot of land around there for these troops to maneuver into. They had railroads and everything in there, into the camp itself. But then the field was, vast areas surrounding. Well, the military took over this vast area.
Months after
Yeah,
the bomb, before you
then they-
went back home.